The old man didn't cry when his family didn't show up to his birthday dinner. He just quietly asked the waiter to cancel the extra plates. But what a biker overheard in that moment would turn an empty night into something nobody in that restaurant would ever forget. Frank Delaney had always believed in showing up. For birthdays, for graduations, for late-night calls when someone needed help moving or money, or just a voice on the other end of the line. He had been there, every time, without fail. At 72, he didn't ask for much in return. Just one evening, one table, one simple dinner with the people he had spent his entire life putting first. The restaurant he chose wasn't fancy, but it meant something. A small, family-owned steakhouse on the edge of town. The kind of place where the booths were worn in just right and the staff remembered your name if you came often enough. Frank had been coming there since his wife, Margaret, was still alive. Back when birthdays meant her laughter echoing across the table, her hands squeezing his when the candles came out, her voice teasing him about getting older while secretly making sure every detail was perfect. This was the first birthday he'd spend there without her. And the first where he'd be relying entirely on others to fill the silence she left behind. He arrived early, of course. He always did. 30 minutes before the reservation, dressed in his best navy blazer, the one Margaret used to say made him look like a man who still had places to be. He shaved twice that morning, just to be sure. Even polished his shoes, though nobody would likely notice. The hostess smiled warmly when he checked in, glancing at the reservation list. Table for 8, right? Happy birthday, Mr. Delaney. Frank smiled back, polite, practiced. Thank you. They should be here soon. He said it with confidence. He had to, because anything less would feel like admitting something he wasn't ready to face. They seated him at the long table near the window. 8 chairs, 8 place settings, 8 neatly folded napkins waiting to be unfolded. A small cluster of balloons tied to the end of the booth swayed gently whenever the door opened, as if even they were expecting someone to walk in at any moment. Frank sat down slowly, placing his hands on the table as he looked around. For a second, just a second, he could almost see it the way it used to be. His daughter Lisa rolling her eyes at her brother's jokes, his son Mark arguing about something trivial just to keep the conversation alive, his grandson Ethan glued to his phone until Frank nudged him and said, "Hey, kid, at least pretend I'm interesting tonight." He let out a soft breath and checked his watch. 10 minutes, early still. Plenty of time. The waiter came over, a young man with a kind face and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he hadn't been working there long. "Can I get you something to drink while you wait?" Frank nodded. "Just water for now. I'll wait until everyone gets here to order." The waiter smiled and hurried off. Frank leaned back slightly, eyes drifting toward the entrance. Every time the door opened, his posture straightened just a bit. Every time it closed on someone who wasn't his family, his shoulders sank a little more. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. The water glass was refilled twice before he even took a sip. He checked his phone. No messages, no missed calls, nothing but the time staring back at him like it had something to prove. He hesitated, then tapped his daughter's name. It rang. Once, twice, then voicemail. "Hey, sweetheart," he said after the beep, keeping his tone light. "Just checking in. Reservations at 6. I'm here already. Take your time. No rush." He hung up before his voice could betray him. 5 more minutes. Then he called his son, straight to voicemail. He didn't leave a message this time. Instead, he sat there, fingers lightly tapping against the table, eyes still fixed on the door like sheer willpower might. Pull them through it. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with life. Families laughing, couples leaning close across candlelit tables, friends clinking glasses and celebrating things that felt suddenly distant to him. He was surrounded by people, and yet the emptiness at his table felt louder than anything else in the room. The waiter returned, hesitating just slightly when he saw the untouched place settings. "Would you like to order something while you wait?" he asked gently. Frank shook his head. No, they'll be here." But his voice didn't carry the same certainty anymore. Another 10 minutes passed. Then another. The balloons had stopped swaying. The chairs remained empty. The plates untouched. Frank stared at the napkin in front of him, carefully folded into a neat triangle, and slowly reached out to unfold it. His hands were steady. They always were. That was something he'd learned a long time ago. How to keep your hands steady even when everything else felt like it was slipping. He placed the napkin in his lap, then looked up one more time as the door opened again. A group of strangers walked in, laughing loudly, completely unaware of the quiet disappointment sitting just a few feet away. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice. Just a small, quiet acceptance settling in where hope had been holding on. Frank exhaled slowly, then raised his hand to signal the waiter. The young man approached quickly, concern flickering across his face. Frank offered him a small, apologetic smile. "I think you can go ahead and cancel the rest of the reservations," he said softly. "Looks like it's just me tonight." He paused, glancing at the empty chairs one last time before adding, almost as an afterthought, "No sense in holding the table." At the bar across the room, a man in a worn leather vest, halfway through a drink, stopped mid-sip as those words carried further than Frank intended. He didn't turn around immediately, but he heard enough. And something about the way the old man said it, not angry, not bitter, just used to being forgotten, made it impossible to ignore. The biker didn't believe in getting involved in other people's business, but something about the way the old man said, "No sense in holding the table," made it impossible for him to stay seated, and before he could talk himself out of it, he was already walking across the room. Ray Carter had spent most of his life minding his own lane. You ride your road, let others ride theirs. That was the unspoken rule. But there were exceptions. There were always exceptions. He set his glass down at the bar and moved slowly, not wanting to draw attention, his boots heavy against the wooden floor as conversations hummed around him. Up close, the scene hit harder. 8 plates, 7 empty chairs, one man sitting straighter than he needed to, like posture alone could fill the space. Ray stopped beside the table and nodded once. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, voice calm, almost casual, like it wasn't a big deal either way. Frank looked up, caught off guard. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face, like he was trying to place this stranger in a memory that didn't exist. Then came the polite reflex he'd carried his whole life. "Oh, sure," he said, gesturing lightly to the chair across from him. "Go ahead." Ray pulled the chair out and sat, resting his forearms on the table, eyes briefly scanning the untouched place settings before settling back on Frank. "Looked like a party," he said, not unkindly. "Figured I'd see what I was missing." Frank let out a small chuckle, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, guess it didn't turn out that way." There was a pause. Not awkward, just honest. Ray leaned back slightly, studying him. "Birthday?" Frank nodded. 72 today. Ray gave a low whistle. "That's a good run." "I suppose it is." Frank glanced at the empty chairs again, then quickly looked away. Used to be louder. Ray didn't rush him. He'd learned over the years that silence made people say more than questions ever could. And sure enough, Frank spoke again, almost like he needed to fill the space before it swallowed him. "My daughter was supposed to fly in," he said, fingers lightly tapping the edge of his glass. "Chicago. Busy job, you know how it is. My son, he lives about 40 minutes from here. Said he'd bring the kids." He smiled faintly. "My grandson promised me he'd show me something on his phone. Some video he thought was funny." His voice softened just a little. "Said I'd laugh." Ray nodded once. "Kids usually write about that." Frank let out another quiet breath. "Yeah, they usually are." The waiter hovered nearby, unsure whether to approach, glancing between the two men. Ray caught his eye and gave a subtle nod, signaling he'd handle it for now. The waiter backed off, relieved. "They call?" Ray asked after a moment. Frank shook his head. "No, but I'm sure something came up." He said it quickly, too quickly, like he'd rehearsed it. "It happens." Ray tilted his head slightly. "Happens often?" Frank didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the window, where cars passed by in a steady stream, headlights cutting through the early evening dark. "More than I'd like to admit," he said finally. "But you get used to it." That word again. Used to it. Ray felt something tighten in his chest, something old and familiar. He'd heard that tone before, from guys who'd lost things they didn't talk about, from brothers who'd buried too many people and learned to carry it quiet. "Don't think anyone should get used to that," Ray said, voice lower now. Frank shrugged gently. "Life has a way of rearranging things. People get busy. Priorities shift." He forced a smile. "I suppose I'm just not at the top of the list anymore." Ray leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "You raised them?" Frank blinked. "Of course. Then you should be." The words were simple, direct, no room for debate. Frank looked at him for a long moment. Something flickering behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the unfamiliar feeling of someone saying out loud what he'd been quietly thinking for years. "That's kind of you to say," he replied softly. "But it doesn't really change anything." Ray exhaled through his nose, glancing at the empty chairs again. 7 empty seats. 7 chances missed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, turning it over in his hand like he was weighing something. "How many were supposed to show?" he asked. 7, Frank said. "Plus me makes 8. Ray nodded slowly. "That's a lot of empty space." "Feels bigger than it is," Frank admitted. Another pause settled between them, but this one felt different. Heavier, like something was about to shift. Ray tapped his thumb against the side of his phone once, then twice, then made a decision. He unlocked it and scrolled through his contacts. Frank watched him, curious but not questioning. "You mind if I make a call?" Ray asked. Frank gave a small shrug. "Go ahead. Don't let me keep you." Ray smirked slightly. "You're not." He brought the phone to his ear and waited. It rang once before someone picked up. "Yeah." A voice answered, rough and familiar. Ray leaned back in his chair, eyes still on Frank. "You boys doing anything right now?" he asked. There was a pause on the other end. "Why?" "I'm at Miller's Steakhouse." Another pause. "Okay, and?" Ray glanced at the table again, then back at Frank, who sat quietly, unsure what was unfolding. "Got a situation," Ray said simply. "Old man. Birthday. 7 no-shows." The line went silent for a second. Then, "You serious?" "Dead serious." Another voice chimed in faintly in the background, asking what was going on. Ray smirked. "Question is, how fast can you get here?" Frank shifted slightly in his seat, a hint of uncertainty creeping in. "You don't have to do anything," he said gently. "Really? I'm fine." Ray held up a finger, still listening to the voice on the phone. "Yeah," he said into it. "All of you. Bring whoever's around." A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, I know it's Thursday. I don't care." He paused, then added, "And hey, come hungry." He hung up before they could argue further and set the phone down on the table. Frank looked at him, brows slightly furrowed. "What exactly did you just do?" Ray leaned back in his chair, completely at ease now. "Canceled your cancellation," he said. Frank blinked. "I'm sorry." Ray nodded toward the empty seats. "You said no sense in holding the table." He gestured around. "I disagree." Frank stared at him, caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "You don't even know me." Ray shrugged. "Don't need to." He tapped the table lightly. "I know enough." Frank opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unsure what to say. Outside, faint at first, there was a distant sound. Low, rolling, almost like thunder. Most people didn't notice it yet, but Ray did. His grin widened just a little as he glanced toward the window. "You might want to stick around," he said casually. "Your party's running a little late, but they're on their way." The old man thought the biker was joking, until the low rumble outside grew louder, deeper, and impossible to ignore, the kind of sound that didn't just pass by but arrived with intention. And within seconds, every conversation in the restaurant began to fade as heads turned toward the windows. At first, it was just curiosity. A few people glanced up from their meals, forks paused midair, trying to place the sound. Then came the unmistakable roar. Engines, multiple, synchronized in a way that made the glass subtly vibrate. Frank frowned slightly, turning in his seat. "What in the world?" he murmured. Ray didn't answer right away. He was watching the entrance, calm as ever, like he'd seen this 1,000 times. Outside, headlights cut across the parking lot in a slow, deliberate sweep. One motorcycle pulled in, then another, then 3 more behind it. Within moments, a full line of bikes rolled into view, chrome gleaming under the streetlights, engines idling like a pack of restless animals. The restaurant staff froze. The hostess stepped back instinctively. A couple near the window stood up just to get a better look. Someone whispered, "Are those bikers?" Like it was both a question and a warning. Frank sat there, completely still, trying to make sense of it. "You didn't," he said quietly, eyes shifting back to Ray. Ray just gave a small shrug. "Told you," he replied. "No reason to waste a good table." One by one, the engines cut off, the sudden silence outside almost louder than the noise had been. Then the door opened. The first man who walked in was tall, heavy-set, wearing a worn leather vest with patches that told stories Frank couldn't begin to understand. He scanned the room once, then locked eyes with Ray. "This him?" he asked, nodding toward Frank. Ray stood up, motioning toward the table. "Birthday boy," he said. The man's expression softened instantly. He walked over without hesitation and stuck out his hand. "Name's Big Al," he said. "Heard he got stood up." Frank blinked, still trying to catch up, but instinct took over. He shook the man's hand. "Frank," he replied. "And I wouldn't say stood up. Just delayed, maybe." Big Al snorted. "Yeah. Well, we don't do delayed." Before Frank could respond, more of them started filing in. Different ages, different builds, but all carrying that same grounded presence, like they belonged wherever they stood. One pulled out a chair and sat down without asking. Another clapped Frank lightly on the shoulder like they'd known each other for years. "Heard it's your birthday," a younger guy said, sliding into one of the empty seats. "Figured we'd crash it." Within minutes, the empty table wasn't empty anymore. Plates that had been sitting untouched suddenly had people in front of them. The waiter stood frozen for a second, then snapped back into action, rushing over. Menus? Drinks?" he stammered. "Yeah," Ray said, sitting back down across from Frank. "We're gonna need everything." The room had completely shifted. What had been a quiet, almost somber corner of the restaurant was now alive with movement, voices overlapping, chairs scraping as more seats filled. Frank looked around, overwhelmed, his eyes moving from one face to another. "You really didn't have to do this," he said, voice unsteady now, not from sadness, but something else, something fuller. Ray leaned forward slightly. "Yeah," he said. "We did." A man near the end of the table pulled out his phone. "Hold on," he said. "This ain't right without a cake." "It's fine," Frank started, but the man was already dialing. "Nope," he said. "Not negotiable." Another biker laughed. "Gas station down the road still open." "I'll run." "Make it quick," someone else called. "Old man's not getting any younger." Frank let out a surprised laugh at that. An actual laugh, the kind that escaped before he could stop it. It caught him off guard. He hadn't heard that sound from himself in a while. The waiter returned with drinks, placing them carefully as the table filled. "So, Frank," Big Al said, leaning back in his chair, "you got 72 years of stories. You better start talking." Frank shook his head, smiling now despite himself. "I don't know where I'd even begin." "Start with the good ones," Ray said. "We've got time." And just like that, he did. He started small, stories about his first job, about meeting Margaret, about the way she used to insist on dancing in the kitchen even when there was no music playing. As he spoke, the noise around him settled into something warm, something real. They listened. Not half listened, not distracted. Actually listened. They laughed in the right places. Asked questions. Filled in the silence not with noise, but with presence. The cake arrived 20 minutes later, store-bought, slightly lopsided, with candles that didn't quite match, but it didn't matter. When they lit them, someone dimmed the lights near the table, and for a moment, everything else in the restaurant faded into the background. "Make a wish," one of them said. Frank looked at the candles, the small flames flickering in front of him. Then he looked up at the people around the table. Strangers, technically, but somehow not. Not anymore. He took a breath. "I think I already got it," he said quietly. Then he leaned forward and blew the candles out. The applause came instantly, loud, unapologetic, filling the room in a way that turned heads and drew smiles, even from people who had no idea what was happening. Someone started singing, off-key but enthusiastic, and the rest joined in. Frank laughed again, shaking his head, wiping at his eyes when he thought no one was looking, but Ray noticed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Hours passed like minutes. Food came and went. Stories were traded back and forth. By the time the night started to wind down, the table that had once felt too big now felt like it wasn't big enough. Chairs had been pulled closer. Space had been made where there wasn't any. And Frank, who had walked in expecting to spend his birthday alone, sat there surrounded by people who had chosen, without obligation, without history, to show up for him. As the bill came, Frank reached for it instinctively, but Ray was faster. "Not tonight," he said. "This one's on us." "I can pay," Frank protested. "I know you can," Ray replied. "That's not the point." Frank hesitated, then slowly pulled his hand back. "Thank you," he said, voice steady but full. Ray nodded once. "Next year," he said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "You call us first." Frank smiled, a real one this time. "Next year," he repeated. Outside, the engines roared back to life one by one, the sound echoing into the night as they rode off the same way they came, in formation, together. Frank stood on the sidewalk long after they were gone, the cool air brushing against his face, the echo of laughter still lingering in his ears. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about who didn't show up. He was thinking about who did.